Welcome to This Week in Introduction to Corrections. This week, we're going to tackle two subjects that both have to do with the inmate experience within our facilities. The first chapter we're going to cover is Chapter 9, which has to deal with more the male side, or the prison subculture and the gang influence that thrives within our prison systems. After that, we will focus more intently on the female experience within our prison systems, what is unique to the female population, and why we need to spend more time on a specific lecture dedicated to just the female population. In the first lecture, we will concentrate on looking at specific theories around prison subculture and what the importation theory is, what the exportation theory is, and why we need to understand both, compare what both is, and understand what they mean to those offenders that are serving time within our facilities. We'll look at modern inmate subculture standards and what has made them change over the time within the last 50 years, the impact that prison culture has on us as correction officers and correction staff working within the facilities. We'll look at the process of prisonization, what that is, and why it's important to understand it. We'll look at various aspects of guard subculture, including the subculture that is unique to female corrections officers. We'll specifically look at what the impact of prison gangs has had on prisons and on the traditional subculture of the past, and why prison systems understand this and what they do to control the gang problems that occur in their facilities. One of the things we have to start with is understanding that there is a commonality to the experiences that happen between inmates and the staff within the prisons. Staff are not immune to what goes on within the prison systems and the prison facilities in which they work, and they will be influenced by the profound social learning that happens within the facility that they work in, and they over time can become more enmeshed in the prison social setting. Some of them may begin to hold within some of the beliefs and some of the norms that they have learned to observe and understand that has become part of the prison culture. What happens as a result of officers becoming more enmeshed with and understanding the prison subculture is that there becomes this understanding between correctional staff and the inmate population. And whether we like it or not, there are some dynamics that will influence our interactions and will create circumstances that are not as black and white and fall within the guidelines of prison regulations. There's this sense of understanding that will develop, and there'll be certain reactions that inmates will come to expect from us, and we will expect certain reactions from inmates. There will be informal rules of conduct where loyalty from the prison inmates will be expected, as well as our staff. But in order for there to remain a symbiotic relationship, which we will talk about later on in this chapter, there will be a level of respect that will be maintained, provided we understand what this commonality involves and the fact that we each impact daily experiences of each other. This will help us understand why facilities operate the way they do, and we can start to understand why the prison subculture is the way it is. The inmate experiences within our facility need us to look at either what they feel is depriving them of their lives, or what they had on the outside that they can bring to the facility in order to help them survive. The first we're going to look at is what they bring into the facility that can help them survive. We look at this as importing what they had on their outside life in order for them to continue to survive. This has been defined as an importation theory. We look at it as if you're going to import ideas into a plan or import goods from another city, you're bringing something in from somewhere else. Same idea when it comes to what an offender is going to bring to his experiences within the prison walls. So an importation theory is going to be that their subculture that they have within the prison is going to be that which is developed because of what they bring in, their beliefs and their norms from outside in the world. So it's going to reflect the subculture that they belong to in the streets. So if they were very respected outside, then they're going to have those types of behaviors on the inside. Most of us in the correctional staff are going to understand and know what the background is of the offenders that we come in contact with, and we're going to know how they behave, and we're going to understand that that's going to influence how they are going to behave on the inside of the facility. Now, one thing we also have to understand is that how a person is socialized outside the prison is usually a long-standing process, and therefore it's going to be much more part of who they are. So people are more likely to bring in so much of what they grew up believing, how they grew up behaving, and what they feel is part of their essence and what they think they should be saying, doing, and acting. The prison environment is also very intense because of how they are required to behave and the fact that it is very enclosed and very isolated. That also has the tendency to leave very deep and entrenched influence in a very short period of time. And so what you're going to have is a constant banging of the import of who they were from the outside and what the prison experience gives them during the short period of time that they're there. But then what you also have is this constant reminder through the messages that they can receive through the technology that we have. You know, it used to be when there was no way to get any sort of messages to them through radio, television, email, and the only way that they could really communicate with the outside world was either by phone or by mail. What happened on the outside world really was limited in their knowledge. And now they get a flood of information all the time. They have access to telephone. They have access to television. They have access, in a lot of cases, because it's contraband, to telephones, cell phones. And so they can continually get these messages from the outside that can continue to influence the way they act and what they do. And so that's going to continue to embolden them, but also influence them on how they act on the inside. And so there are going to be ways that the outside world will not continue to influence them. And so you're going to have this importation theory that continues to derive and describe how many people are going to act within the inside of the walls. That is what importation theory is. The contrast to the importation theory is that the prison subculture is mostly the product of offenders being socialized while they are inside the prison. Gresham Sykes, who did not do most of his work until the mid-1950s, introduced the idea that offenders that were deprived of everything that they knew while they were inside the prison walls was the reason for the prison subculture. This is referred to as the pains of imprisonment. Pains of imprisonment are the various inconveniences or the deprivations that offenders incur while they are incarcerated. What it does is look at what the prison does, or the effects that being in prison for a prolonged period of time has on the inmates, and how they are forced to cope with this while they are incarcerated. Gresham Sykes broke these 5 areas of deprivation into, number 1, the fact that they have the loss of liberty. Now, liberty for us is our freedom. And so the first idea of the pain of imprisonment and what forces an offender to be part of the prison subculture is the fact that they all have in common the fact that they don't have their freedom anymore. The second deprivation is the fact that they have lost the goods and services that they are so used to having while they are out in the world. Things like being able to go to a restaurant, go to church, be able to have sex when they want with their wives. So goods and services that are buy drugs. The third one is the loss of heterosexual relationships, both sexual and non-sexual. And so this deprivation then forces the offender into a prison subculture where, in order to have that release, they are going to engage in homosexual behavior, whether it is consensual or non-consensual. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. The fourth deprivation is the loss of autonomy, and the fact that they are living in an environment where they no longer have a sense of self, where they don't get to rely on themselves. They are being told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and have to rely on other people to give them their daily duties and how they can do things. And they, most of the time, especially back in the mid-50s, did not have cells to themselves, and if they did, they were very small and were only allowed there at night. The last deprivation was the idea of the loss of personal security. Not having the security that you have on the outside and the tools to be able to ensure your own personal security, whether it's a weapon or your wits, also forces you to band together in a subculture where you have your own code, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but have to rely on other means in order to ensure your own personal safety. Because of this, the prison environment or the subculture are going to create their own value systems, and they're going to come up with ways that only they can use to rely on and find ways to make life easier on the inside and make these deprivations seem less harmful and hard for them to handle. As a result, they're going to come up with things such as rhyming, tattooing, and forms of dress that are going to be, to us as staff and the outside society, forms of rebellion, but for them, ways of survival. Things like sagging, which we know to be an annoyance because inmates have placed their pants below their underwear, but in actuality originated in jails and prisons because the inmates were denied the use of belts, because belts were tools that inmates could use to commit suicide. This simple value that was used by inmates in their subculture came as a way to identify and deal with a deprivation, a personal loss of autonomy that now had transformed itself into the society in the 1990s as a statement of African American solidarity, as well as a way to offend white society, but originally came from prison systems as a way to counteract the fact that they couldn't have belts in prisons. So you see, there are two ways to handle being within our prison walls. You are either going to import the way that you have been living your life on the outside in order to bring that reputation and that way of living into the prison facility, or you are going to socialize yourself within the prison and deal with these pains of imprisonment in your own way, and then transport those back into society the best way you know how. They're contrasting. Some will learn to survive one way and others another. And there are going to be examples of both within the prison systems that we work in today. As mentioned in the earlier slide, the subculture that we see in 21st century corrections shows that there is an inmate subculture that has both the products of an importation theory as well as a deprivation theory. What influences a person's or an offender's adaptation to how they handle their time in prison is their accountability and how they are able to adapt is going to determine their participation within the inmate economy. Now, the inmate economy and the research done into this is done by the authors that are mentioned on this slide. One of the things is that the prison economy, which we've talked about earlier, drives everything that happens in the prison subculture. The prison economy and the subculture that runs it is a multi-million-dollar industry that runs within every prison throughout the United States. The more resources an inmate has, the wealthier that he is seen within the eyes of other inmates within the institution. And those that are able to continue to gain wealth in whatever that is, or the fact that they can become smarter or more manipulative, and the more that they can negotiate through using the prison economy, then they are going to have more influence on the prison subculture. So the research that has been out there is you may be part of the importation theory or the exportation or deprivation theory, but if you are an inmate that has been able to master the prison economy, then you're going to be able to influence contacts both inside and outside the prison. And as we are going to see when we talk about the gang culture later on in this lecture, we're going to see that it is the gang culture that is extremely influential when it comes to running the economy. So it is not black or white, and we see the contrast of both theories, but in order to be part of the prison subculture, you have to understand where the influence comes from, and you need to be able to be part of it to negotiate and influence the thing that drives the subculture, which is the economy. Early research into the offender population showed that there was a subculture that had a strict convict code. And it was these early portrayals in television film that showed a somewhat fluid code of conduct that had a set standard of behavior. And that if you paid attention to this convict code and had this set of beliefs that you aspired to live by while you were in the prison, then you would be able to get the respect of the inmates, and you would be continually proving that you were worthy of the title. Now, the convict code is based on the fact that you are a convict. And with this title, you opposed all the values that were in society, and therefore you also were going to oppose any authority within the prison while you were there. You opposed all of the policies, and you were not going to be in league with any of the staff or administrators. The most serious infraction, of course, if you were going to abide by the convict code, was to not be a snitch. Snitches, of course, were any inmate who was going to reveal any activity of other inmates to correctional officers or staff. At one time, they were considered the lowest of the low. In the old school or prisons of 30, 40, 50 years ago plus, they were considered to be afforded no respect, and if you were found out to be a snitch, chances were you had to be placed in a special area, most likely protective custody, and if you were ever found out, you were going to be most likely assaulted, if not killed. The most notorious incident of snitches being attacked was at the New Mexico State Penitentiary in Santa Fe in 1980, at the tail end of when snitch assaults were prominent, where the inmates got a hold of the prison There was a prison riot, and parts of the prison had been controlled by the inmates. They eventually broke into the cell block, which had been known to house the cell or prison inmate informants. And as a result, a lot of these inmates were tortured and killed. This riot is still to this day considered one of the worst, next to Attica, within the corrections history. If you look it up on YouTube, you will see some information on it, but there is very little, as it was so bad that they actually tore down the old New Mexico State Penitentiary and had to rebuild, and that the bodies that died there, that they found there once they were able to quell the riot, were horrifically killed. In our modern world of corrections, those inmates who are willing to serve as informants are a little bit more frequent, and it came as a result of the war on drugs during the 1990s. And as a result, we have a lot more inmates who are willing to give up and give information in order to serve their own purpose and get less time within prison. And so we've seen kind of a flip, and there's no such thing as kind of an honor-bound system where you don't snitch. The modern-day inmates, the willingness to do one's time with honor is a little bit of a lower priority. And so they're finding that the newer inmates, the younger inmates, are more in tune to a modern society where you can get things in an instant and be not inconvenienced. And if they can find themselves not being on lockdown, or they can get something instantaneous like a lower sentence, they're going to do it, and they're not going to protect anybody. And so the incidence of informants is kind of increased over the last 30 years. But in the old days, this convict code regarding snitches was hard, fast, and true. And we find that now that we're in the 21st century, and as a result of the war on drugs, people trying to save themselves, we had a higher incidence in the convict snitch code, and there was more snitches willing to give information. As I mentioned earlier, one of the pains of imprisonment was the loss of heterosexual relationships, both sexual and non-sexual. As a result, this slide will talk about what happens when we have sex offenders within our prison walls, and what happens to those who are taken advantage of because they are sex offenders or because they are considered to be weaker than other inmates, and what happens to them. Sex offenders, particularly going to be those who prey on children, have typically been afforded really no respect while they are in prison. And so in the early to mid 1900s, so we're talking early 20th century, they were the ones who were preyed upon the most and typically had a high mortality rate. That type of action is becoming less and less prevalent. And so those that are going to assault those other inmates are going to be taken care of. You got to remember the type of atmosphere that was in our prison system in the early 20th century. Staff was less monitored. We didn't have the civil rights claims that we have in place now. And so there was more of a chance that somebody who was found out to have been a pedophile or a child molester or a sex offender could be handled, whether by the prison or not, prison offenders or not. That really doesn't exist nowadays. And so those types of offenses that are becoming more prevalent and detected by the justice system will afford that offender either time in protective custody, or because of the privacy laws, they can be in general population, and if they really understand what their safety would mean, they will not actually come forward with what they're really in prison for. And now we also have programs for sex offenders to try and reform and not be sex offenders through programming and treatment. If they are sex offenders, a lot of times what happens is if they are found out, then the prison gangs are going to be preying upon them and turning them out, which basically means they're going to become a punk. And it's a derogatory term for somebody who is going to engage in homosexual activity, which implies that they are going to be feminine, weak, and subservient to masculine inmates. What this also means is that whether they are homosexual or not, they are going to be part of this subculture that is going to be forced into homosexual activity. What is going to happen is they will be considered a woman in prison and be used as that because of this pain of imprisonment that we talked about in an earlier slide, and they will then be used as a way for the inmates to try and deal with the loss of sexual activity and act it out that way. Now, what we're going to talk about in the next slide is what the correction system is trying to do to ward off this type of behavior, and that's called the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. Understanding that we did have a subculture who would either consensually or non-consensually force men to have sex. In 2003, there was a law passed that would carry out a comprehensive statistical review and analyze just how often are the incidents as well as the effects of prison sexual assault in each calendar year. Now, what this does is allow the Bureau of Justice Statistics to go through and identify what the common characteristics of both those that are victimized and those that perpetrate the crime of sexual assault within the prison and prison systems. Now, what this means as far as prison systems are concerned is that it does not limit itself to just correctional facilities. It also includes jails, community corrections, and juvenile detention facilities. What they came up with in 2003 and spent quite a few years trying to hammer out exactly what the standards were going to be is that they were going to go out and try and get at least a 10% sample of federal, state, and county prisons to find out just exactly whether or how prevalent sexual assault within these facilities were. Then they were going to use these surveys to try and figure out what the and do it confidentially of former inmates of these same institutions. What they wanted to do, both for males and females, is try and find out just how prevalent sexual assault within the facilities were. By 2012, they had within it a set of standards, and now we make it part of our everyday conscious in order to work within our facilities. One of the things that they did find out within their first several years of surveys is that it wasn't necessarily heterosexual males or heterosexual females that were the most at risk of sexual assault. But what it was transgendered individuals, mostly male to female transgendered individuals that were the most at risk of being sexually assaulted within our facilities. And therefore, some of the most recent policies that have been made within our institutions nationwide have had to deal with how we care for, protect, and make sure that this section of the LGBTQ community are protected and assisted with making sure that they are not victimized during their stays within our facilities. Another thing that came from the first set of statistics that came out of the surveys and research that came out was that staff was responsible for a great percentage of those that were victimized, both heterosexual and transgender. So staff is primarily and significantly a great percentage of those that are responsible for sexual assault within our facilities. So it's those types of things that need to be taken into consideration when it comes to what we need to do, what it requires, and the guidelines to which must be adhered to when it comes to the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003. We'll talk much more about this in Chapter 11, which is our next lecture, because of the female inmate, but we did need to mention this here. When we talk about what type of inmate is expected within the prison subculture, it is going to be a man or an inmate who shows no emotion and shows that they are free from fear, depression, and anxiety. This is going to be known as the strong silent type. General idea is that inmates must do their own time without becoming involved in the personal business of others, also part of the early convict code. Getting involved with other people's business is what is equal to being a gossip, which is not part of being your time within facilities. And because of that, it is also considered to be effeminate behavior. Because it is not considered manly to be this way, inmates have to mind their own business. If you stick to the rules, inmates are considered to be a convict, a true convict, which is going to be someone who is respected for being self-reliant, independent of others in the system, which in turn will make them considered to be superior and, while not necessarily going to be considered a leader, will often make them very respected by those younger inmates that come into the prison. Also part of being the strong silent type is being proficient within the slang in the prison systems. Now, one of the things that we know from any time working within our system is that every prison system within the United States has some sort of slang that's going to be used. Slang has the consistency throughout the United States, but the terminology is going to be varied from state to state, which means that what slang our prison system uses here in Michigan might be totally different than the slang that's used down south, say in Alabama or Mississippi. But once we know what the slang word is, we're going to understand that there is a commonality as far as the word itself, what it means. So there is things like a shank. Most prison systems know that a shank means a knife. Bug juice is usually referred to as psychotropic medication. And green light typically is going to refer to an okay to go ahead and assault another inmate. They are commonly used throughout prison systems in the United States. But other systems may have specific terms for things within their own prison system depending on what their vernacular is going to be, such as in Texas, because that has a very high proportion of Latino inmates, a lot of their slang might have a Latino slant to it. We don't have that many, or at least not a disproportionate amount, and so ours might not have quite the Latino flair to it. And so that we just have to keep in mind. But remember, there is slang. There is slang throughout the prisons in the United States, and if we become familiar with that slang, we can understand what they're saying. One of the things that is most important among the inmates is the fact of respect. If you hear about anything other than respect within the prisons, it is going to be about how to maintain respect, how to not be disrespected, and therefore respect is going to be what the status of the prison and offenders revolves around. It's the inmate's sense of standing, and the term represents what is going to be an inmate's stay within there. And therefore, if an inmate feels that they've been disrespected, they're going to feel that it is a brush against their honor, and they are going to want to do everything in their power to get it back. Because if an inmate, through the pains of imprisonment, has lost their autonomy and has lost ways to control what they can control, one thing they feel they can control is how they are respected. And if they feel they have been disrespected, then they are going to do what is in their power to get that respect back. And therefore they are going to then go into any means to get that back. And therefore they are not going to go into take assistance, from any other inmates. It's considered a sign of weakness. And if you are going to be tested, then you need to pass those tests. If you're a new inmate, then you need to understand how the inmate subculture works, and a debt is always paid. And if you can't pay your debts, then you might be called upon to do favors, and one of those favors might be to act as a mule. Now, a mule on the outside means that you're going to smuggle. A mule on the inside means the same thing, and therefore you might be called on to smuggle drugs into the prison for another inmate. So maintaining respect is one of the highest priorities for inmates within the subculture. Remember, we're always talking about the prison subculture, and those who feel their respect has been questioned are going to do what it takes to get it back. Really quickly, for the things that we're going to talk about in this slide are just some really quick definitions and what they mean to the subculture. There's a constant push and pull between the need to con others and the absolute assurance that you're not being conned. And so that's a balance that offenders in our facilities are trying not to keep. They're trying to keep the balance of. So one of the things they're trying to do is perform a hustle. So they're trying to deceive, manipulate, or take advantage of another person, while trying also not to be hustled. And inmates who are able to get over on others by either like getting others to do their work for them, or being able to maybe get over on an officer, are going to be looked upon as savvy and being able to work the system. If you're hogging, which is something that's being used, that is a particularly prevalent term within the Texas prison system, which unfortunately your author worked in, so he relies quite a bit on his experience within the Texas prison system. Then you are using others for some type of gain or benefit. So basically you're manipulating others to do what you should be doing. And so hustle and hogging, a couple of definitions that, because the book uses them pretty prevalently, you need to be aware of. But I would make sure you understand what hustle is, and the fact that in convicts, the idea is to constantly balance hustle and not being hustled, and how being part of the prison subculture is that constant battle of being able to hustle other inmates without being hustled yourself. As we talked about in the very first slide, what is interesting about the prison system itself is the dynamics between inmates and staff. We have this understanding that we know kind of what they're going through. Correctional staff and inmates develop this kind of negotiation so that we know what is acceptable for institutional security and what we need to meet the inmates' basic human needs. It's this symbiotic prison relationship that is grounded in the reality of the day-to-day interactions that we're going to continually bring. And what I think a lot of people don't get is when we go back every day for 8 to 10 to 12 hours, sometimes 16 hours if we're understaffed, is that over the years, it's very natural for this type of relationship to occur. The rules of the institution are clearly written. We know what they are. They're not always pragmatic. And so we, as officers, are always going to be the ones who have to look at the realities of the situation and consider what is best for the running of our floor versus the pragmatality or the actuality of what we can do to make the floor run efficiently. Sometimes it's more important to create the connection between both groups, even though we both understand that we are in an environment that is odorous, and we have a role that we both must uphold. Never will a day go by that you don't understand that you are the corrections officer and they don't understand that they are the offender. But there is necessary to be a give and take. And it's necessary to have this give and take to avoid extremes in rules that, for the most part, don't create just situations. If you, over your career, can master that type of negotiation, you will gain the respect of inmates, even from other officers. This is considered to be the fact that you will become a convict boss or convict officer where you have an understanding of the convict logic and socialization. And you use this to maximize the control that you have over your assigned post. You are not, as an officer, conceived as weak, but a good degree of common sense is what you have, and you are able to use that on the inmates within the facility. You have to understand that discretion is what is used, and you only get this discretion with time, experience, and education and knowledge. And we also must understand that we as officers also have kind of an importation theory that we use. Mannerisms and how we act are going to reflect not only the type of upbringing that we have, but the value system that we operate, as do the inmates. And this is going to be important because how we act in our first few weeks is going to determine how we're going to be throughout our career. We size them up, they size us up. It's how the game is played. And how we deal with the prison subculture and how we work with our own subculture, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, is going to determine how this symbiotic relationship is going to progress through our entire career. The idea of prisonization is the process of being socialized into the prison culture. We've been talking about that consistently through this lecture. And correctional officers also experience a form of prisonization because over our career, being a corrections officer impacts our worldview. And it also is going to impact the way we operate within our prisons and jails. Prison is the extent that exerts its influence upon the social relations of those who enter its domain. That comes to us from Gillespie in a work that he wrote in 2002. So it doesn't just affect the offenders, it also affects the staff and the officers who work inside it. For those of you that are already in the field, how do you see the world now that you've been inside, even if you only work 8 or 12 hours a day? Do you see it crueler? Do you see it with a harder edge than you used to? That is part of our prisonization process also. Influence of prison environment extends to all persons who enter its domain, even if it's not for prolonged periods of time. But as far as the inmates are concerned, the experiences of the inmates prior to being imprisoned are central to determining how well they will adapt to the prison experience. And therefore, we need to understand that with them, because it's 24 hours a day, it will be much harsher. But for us, it will extend to us because of how we deal with our own subculture, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, and that is that of the guard subculture. One thing we have to realize is that the notion of a guard subculture is still fairly new, and therefore is still very controversial as to its existence and what exactly it does. But in talking about the idea of the fact that there is a guard subculture, and I would say that I would like to talk about it as an officer subculture. I personally do not like the term guard. We understand that the fact that we are also within the prison and jail facilities on a day-to-day basis and are subjected to the same types of things on the inside, but also then are exposed to the outside world also, gives us a unique it gives us a unique perspective that allows us to mitigate the debilitating effects of being inside the facility, and allowing us to continue to be within our society will also mitigate the degree of which we become socialized to the prison environment. But what it also does is, because we do spend half of our life, half of our day within that prison environment, it has a tendency to have a degree of adaptation. And so there's a couple of things we need to look at as far as what is going to influence an officer subculture. The type of institution that an officer works in is going to impact the socialization that they come across within that subculture. And so one of the distinctions is we're all a brotherhood. Whether you work in the jails, whether you work in the state prisons, whether you work in the federal prisons, we all understand what it's like to work in a correctional facility. But when we talk about the guard culture or the officer subculture, we're going to talk about the type of institution that we work in is going to impact the degree of socialization. Working in a jail is a different type of subculture. Working in a small jail is a different type of subculture than working in a large jail. The type of large jail you work in is going to be different than working in, if you work in Rikers Island as opposed to working in Kent County or Ingham County or Clinton County, there's a different subculture, but you still have a subculture. And working in a jail as opposed to working in a prison, it's a different subculture, but you're still correctional officers. Working in a level 1 prison as opposed to working in a level 5 prison is going to impact your socialization, but you are still part of a guard subculture, an officer subculture. What we need to do is look at what factors can impact how the prison culture affects individual officers, and to the degree that you as officers can become enmeshed in this officer subculture. What we have to understand is that any image that the public or that we have had of how it's portrayed in the media is often shown as brutal, uncaring, and that inmates are always hostile, violent, and abusive. I spent 25 years in corrections, and I was part of the jail officer subculture. I can tell you, were there some inmates that were hostile, violent, and abusive? Yes. But over the course of my career, I would say that 90% of the inmates were just part of an inmate subculture that wanted nothing more than to get through their time. 60% of them had mental illness. Another 30% of them had substance abuse issues. Most of them were there on minor offenses. And what we need to understand is, while I was there as the officer, I became part of a subculture that tried to understand. Were there days I had to be harder than others? Yes. Were there days I had to be understanding? Absolutely. And so we have to understand our part in this symbiotic relationship. We also have to understand that research that's been done puts out there that the officer subculture does not develop due to any single contextual characteristic. So there's no such thing as our subculture developing because of prisonization or outside indigenous forms of influence or any sort of importation of values. It is a culture that is a product, a complex interaction that is a result of all these things: importation, socialization, deportation, and cultural evolution. It takes what is the best and worst of all of us and brings it together. And so we have things that are behind what this officer subculture is. Just like a convict code, we have basic tenets of what this officer subculture is. We always go to the aid of an officer in distress. That is what makes us a cohesive and working staff. We do not traffic drugs. We cannot and should not tell on other officers unless it is illegal. We should not disrespect another officer in front of inmates, even if you think that officer has done something grossly wrong. Do not talk about them in front of other inmates. That shows discord, and that shows a weakness within the officer corps. Wait until they are out of hearing or in a locker room. Always support an officer who is in a dispute with an inmate. Again, you need to show that you are a cohesive officer corps. Don't be friends with an inmate. One of the things that can bring your career down in a hurry is overfamiliarity and fraternization. And you need to maintain cohesion against all outside groups. Unfortunately, sometimes, depending on where you are, this could also mean not only the supervisory ranks, but also the outside public, media, and even one's own family. I don't believe in this one. I think in order to maintain some and more kind of your own sanity over the course of your career, you need to have outside friends. You need to have more than just your job. But you also should know to have that cohesion, which becomes harder and harder with newer generation jails that only require one person per post with no partners. To maintain that cohesion becomes harder and harder. And so it becomes more important to have that within the ranks. A lot of times they don't, this officer subculture doesn't happen on timelines that are strict, and we need to know that the term guard has really not been used much in the last 20 years or 30 years, and why I don't enjoy it much anymore. We are officers because of the professionalization that we have seen to this job and career within the last 30-35 years. We are better trained, we are better educated, we have better knowledge of the systems in which we work. And because of that and the research that's been done, we know better how to work within these systems. As far as female correctional officers are out there, the field has been predominantly male dominated for many years. We're going to talk more about female corrections officers in the next lecture, but let it be known that over the last 40 years, women have become increasingly represented in the field of corrections, and that while they historically had not worked in direct male supervision in male offenders, they started to in the late 70s and early 80s, and once they started working within the supervising male inmates, they started to break a lot of barriers. The typical rules for women were to watch over female offenders and also to, maintain programming and things like that. Putting them in the security ranks greatly impacted the organizational culture of prisons across the United States. And while women generally do not have the same aggressive social skills, what it does is make them better negotiators. And while in some prisons, it can be tougher for women to gain respect, once they do, the men treat them, I have found in my experience, will treat them with respect and treat them sometimes better than the male officers. So while they are treated and increasingly represented within the field of corrections, what we find is there are still some challenges, but in the 21st century, and we'll talk about this more in the next lecture, female corrections officers are starting to become more routine and starting to generate their own subculture within women's prisons facilities. Now we're going to talk about the impact of gangs upon the prison subculture. They are a group that tends to not adhere to the convict code that we talked about earlier in this lecture. It's one of the things that has made it one of the transitions that we've seen into the 21st century. Whereas the early research that was done on offender life within prisons showed a pretty strict code among convicts in the older days of prison life. What we find is, since we've had an infiltration of gangs within our prison subculture, is they really don't pay attention to the convict code of the past. What they pay attention to is the allegiances that they brought in or they imported from the outside gangs that they belong to. And we're going to talk about what that means when in the next slide, when we talk about this impact of cross-pollination, when we have the influences of street gangs and the influence of prison gangs meshing together. Because what happens is you have this distinct subculture with the gangs, whether you're in the street or in prison. And the distinction between the gangs is that they have a familial style. Basically, they comprise of a distinct family hierarchy. And so they're going to stick to their own families typically, and they show this true loyalty through this blood in, blood out type of tenet. So what happens is they're going to hang out on the streets together. So when they hang out on the streets together and then they end up being sentenced to prison, they're going to meet up in a prison together. They form bonds while they're in prison. They make up their gangs while they're in prison, and then they reunite when they're on the streets, and they continue this cycle while they're in their lifetimes together. And so then they tend to just continually enmesh, whether they're on the streets or in prisons, and this continues through this cross-pollination. So let's continue this idea of cross-pollination on our next slide. Because a lot of our prison gang members were prior street gangs, what happens is the leaders become in prison, but they still are able to give orders to the gang members that are outside the prison walls. And so the cross-pollination that we have means that the gang has developed such power and influence that they are equally effective regardless of whether they are outside or inside of a prison. And so as a result of that, they have been labeled a security threat group by the prisons, which means they are high functioning and they are organized, they use illegal industry, which means everything they do is illegal, to function what they do. And because of this, they have a shot caller, who is a person who either the inmates or gang members will dictate what members will do within the hierarchy. So the idea behind the shot caller is it doesn't matter whether you're inside or outside of prison. You're going to be able to do whatever the gang tells you you're going to do. And as a result, the prison gang members do not simply discard their membership once their sentence is served and they're paroled. So they're a gang member inside prison, they're a gang member outside of prison, and they are required to maintain their membership and do what is called upon them, whether they are paroled, whether they are in prison, whether they are on the street, doesn't matter. And so they are going to continue to develop this reputation and association among their members, and the affiliation and organizational characteristics of these security threat groups, our prison and street affiliation is going to be based on race, ethnicity, geography, ideology, or a combination of all of those things. Any member of a street gang or a prison gang is going to seek protection from the other gang members in or out of prison. And they will mutually take care of any incarcerated member's family. And the group's mission is going to integrate with any economic objective, which means they're going to take whatever illegal means necessary to make it work. Gang membership, therefore, is porous in nature. It's going to be within or outside of prison, and they will be able to get potential recruits. Prison gangs tend to have very formal rules and a written constitution. And therefore, they're structured along kind of a semi-military organizational scheme. So as members circulate in and out of prison, they're going to continue this prison or this gang membership. As a result, prison and street gangs line has been blurred over time. And as we're going to see, when we talk about who the major prison gangs are, you're going to see that some of them started in prison and are now in the streets. Some of them were street gangs that just continued their reign while they are in prison. And now that we have this major cross-pollination, we really don't know whether they are primarily a prison gang or if they are primarily a street gang, or if it really doesn't matter, because they have enough of a representation on both that they are just a security threat group, and whether they're in prison or on the street, they need to be controlled. Prison gangs in the United States actually started in the 50s and 60s, and this was during segregation, and so a lot of times the gangs were started as a way for each particular race or ethnicity to try and protect themselves. They were particularly prevalent in the southern U.S. and California. The first Latino was the Mexican Mafia in the 1950s, and with this came more and more gangs throughout Texas and California, and they started to actually move west. So as we saw the 50s and 60s start prison gangs, we saw then street gangs become prevalent in the 80s. And as a result, what we found was in the 21st century, late 20th, early 21st century, we saw this cross-pollination. And so in the next slide, we're going to go over some of the more prevalent gangs across the United States. They're mostly California, Texas-based, but because of how mobile they are, because of their business interests and ventures, you're going to find that probably a smattering of them are across every state here in the United States. As mentioned in the previous slide, the Mexican Mafia, which is also known as La M, was formed in the late 50s in the California prison system. Has a lot of strict rules. Most members are Mexican American and belonged to a California street gang. Gang's main source of income is drugs, outside prison, and distributing meth, cocaine, heroin, marijuana. Some of them have direct links to Mexican drug traffickers, and they also have some involvement in gambling and prostitution in prisons. The Black Guerrilla family actually started as a prison gang in San Quentin, which is in California, and they're also very centralized within the California prison system. They have a code of ethics, and they prominently are in either California or Maryland. The Aryan Brotherhood, who many people have heard of, originally also formed in San Quentin, and they are part of both California Department of Corrections, and they also have a pretty big membership in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They are heavy drug traffickers and have some business with Mexican drug cartels, and are extremely violent, being involved in some murder for hire, and are involved mostly in California. As for the Crips and the Bloods, they started out as street gangs and have emerged as a major gang presence, and have gone through the Los Angeles metropolitan area. They are also operating in 221 cities and 41 states, and also are in several prison systems. The Bloods are active in 33 states, in 123 systems, as well as many prison systems. NETA was actually established in Puerto Rico, which, don't forget, is a United States territory. And because of that, they spread to the United States. They are primarily in the Northeast, 36 cities and 9 states. The Texas Syndicate, of course, is going to be within Texas, and they formed in response to other prison gangs, which you'll find a lot of these major prison gangs were, and are mostly Latino. The Mexicanemi prison gang is also part of the Texas prison system. Like I said, your author worked in the Texas prison system. The Nazi lowriders are part of the California Youth Authority. The Tango Blast is one of the largest prison street criminal gangs in Texas. And the last one is MS-13, operating out of Los Angeles, mostly Salvadoran immigrants that are operating, have as far off as Virginia and Maryland. So these are not by in any means a full comprehensive, but they are the major prison gangs, but they also have a street presence that makes that cross-pollination harder to deal with. In order to try and handle gangs within any facility, you have to have a comprehensive policy. Within this comprehensive policy, there needs to be legal precedents, procedures, guidelines, and an attempt to verify gang members. What you'll find is most gang members will not admit that they belong to a gang. Luckily, there are ways to identify them. So you have, over the years, many state systems have come up with ways to try this. They have gang intelligence units. Most staff is given some education and training on gangs and gangs activity. And so what we have are now a more sophisticated way and technical aspects of trying to combat security threat groups in prison, which is paper classification, procedures that are needed to try and investigate. But a lot of it also is going to have to include a human element, which is a lot more difficult because you have to have open communication, which is not encouraged among security staff, and you have to also have the knowledge of the prison subculture. So you have to make sure that you remain vigilant, because you never know when part of the correctional staff that you've chosen to serve on this gang task force might actually be a member or part of or knowledge of, friend of the gang that you're trying to bring under control. Some of the things that have been commonly used to try and manage the gang population is along the lines of administrative segregation, which is to take them out of general population and put them in isolation. It prevents them from coming into contact with enemy gang members, also prevents them from communicating with their own gang members. But if you do this, there is chances that you can have that isolation create more problems as far as building solidarity. Even trying to put them in isolation can reinforce the feelings that what they're trying to do is right, and they can try and it doesn't protect it's very expensive, because what you're doing is placing somebody in solitary confinement. It cannot be a long-term solution because of how expensive it is. And so trying to figure out how to control gang activity is not easy. But over the years, the over-reliance on administrative segregation has actually been one of the things that they've relied on the most. And so they continue to do that over the course of several facilities. That concludes this lecture on prison subculture and prison gang influence. We talked about the importation theory and exportation theory. We talked about modern inmate subculture standards and the impact of prison culture on corrections staff. We talked about the process of prisonization and the various aspects of officer subculture, including the unique subculture of female correctional officers. We talked about prison gangs and what the impact has had on prisons, including the traditional prison subculture, and explained what prison systems do to control problems with gangs that occur in their facilities. At this time, please go to the next lecture, which is Chapter 11, on females in our correctional systems.